If BBC confirmed something, that was it. You did not question it. It was the final word on any event or any incident in the world. But was BBC really telling the truth the way we understand it today? Was New York Times really projecting truth the way we see it today? And when we say leftist thought, what was it? It was essentially Marxism. It was essentially Leninism to some extent also. The left wing made nationalism such a bad word and such a taboo that an entire space got created, a vacuum got created for somebody else to capture that, for somebody else to use that and cash on. There was a standard formula of success. What was that? You write human rights violation stories against the Indian state. You will go to junkets. You will get fellowships. You will get scholarships. You will get awards. You will get global recognition because you are bashing the Indian state. If you look at Twitter, if you look at Facebook, if you look at the big tech media today, what are they doing? They are going against the grain of liberal thought. They are going against the grain of Western liberal tradition. From countries like Pakistan, it was Imran Khan's point of view that got a lot of traction on Twitter because he slammed Macron. He slammed the whole idea of free expression and free speech. The Chinese Communist Party can cleanse them of Islam because the CCP thinks that Islam is a disease. That's how they're treating Muslims in China. Hi, this is Aarti Tikoo. You're watching Defensive Offense English. How did we come to a point where we started describing media as left-wing and right-wing? Do they really exist? Can media be really left-wing and right-wing? How have we come to this point? I think we will really have to look at media essentially from the World War II onwards history. What happens after World War II? We know that, India, for example, became free. We know that US and NATO forces, Europe, there is a lot of synergy after the World War II. US becomes the superpower. It is declared as the power in the world. Essentially, taking over the British colonial power, which was up to Second World War, the biggest power on the earth. And from that point onwards, what you really see is the media rising in the West and deciding for the rest of the world what is right, what is wrong. You also get to see, aspirational people in any of the democracies, including India. They are looking towards the West. They are looking towards what is coming out of the West. Whether it is, newspapers or magazines or television. For the longest time, for example, many Indians did not even have television. Many Indians did not even read newspapers, right? But the aspirational class or the elite class or the intellectual class in India was reading whatever was coming out of the intellectual classes of the West. Now, what was really the West doing in terms of narrative building? When, you asked me this narrative building. But what is narrative building? What are we really reading and what are we consuming as consumers when we read something and when we watch something? So, if you really look at the history, you see that, for a long time, New York Times has been seen as the epitome of intellectualism. BBC, for example, as I was growing in Kashmir, BBC was the epitome of truth. If BBC confirmed something, that was it. You did not question it. It was the final word on any event or any incident in the world. But was BBC really telling the truth the way we understand it today? Was New York Times really projecting truth the way we see it today? And I actually have researched this subject as a journalist because I was curious while studying journalism and while being in this profession, working on the ground, trying to understand my own profession, trying to understand how media formulates its own narratives and how it tries to avoid the biases and prejudices that we are often accused of. And unfortunately, the reality that I encountered after going through New York Times, BBC, and this is not just me, anyone, I actually urge your viewers to go back to the archives of New York Times, go back to the archives of BBC, go back to the archives of any English media in the West whom we were copying, who our intellectuals were copying. You read what they were writing. You see what they were showing to the rest of the world. You will realize what much later Edward Said, who is known as a thinker who came from Middle East and who came out with a book called Orientalism. So what did he really say? That the West has a certain prism with which it looks at the third world or the non-West or the East. So basically segregation of East and West. West has its own perspective, certain parameters, certain understanding of the East, and it defines East through those parameters and through that prism. So that is why the image and the impression of India, the stereotype of India, for example, was the land of snake charmers, as if there was nothing else in India, as if you did not have anything else except for snake charmers. Whereas the truth is that if you really look at India's own history, India's own traditions and rituals and customs of history formulation. I come from Kashmir, which is perhaps the only place which has a documented history of 5,000 years. But do we get to see that representation in the Western press? No, we do not. Western press sees Kashmir from a very different angle. It sees it from a political angle. And that political angle comes from the fact that the Indian subcontinent was a colony of the British Empire. So the British Empire had an understanding of India based on its own position in India. It was the ruler and we were the ruled. So it defined India in ways that went into its self-interest, that allowed it to rule India. And you will see the NYT and BBC and the entire Western press defining India in those terms. After World War II, that process continues. And, Prime Minister Nehru, for example, he was seen as a liberal socialist who had absorbed and also aligned himself with the leftist politics, leftist ideology to a certain extent. He was not really left, but he was seen as a centrist. He called himself in many ways a centrist because on the one hand, for example, he talked about Indian nation. He talked about Bharat Maa Ki Jai. He talked about discovery of India. He talked about India as a religio-cultural continuum. He talked about India as a historical identity, historical and geographical identity. And at the same time, he's also in favor of socialism. He's also in favor of Soviet Union philosophy. He's also in favor of Marxism to some extent, because India, to begin with, in the circumstances that Nehru became Nehru, in the circumstances Gandhi became Gandhi, they were far more inclined towards the leftist thought than the right, because India had suffered at the hands of colonial capitalists. They had suffered because of capitalism, the East India capitalism, right? East India Company's capitalism. So somewhere the absorption and internalization of leftist thought, and when we say leftist thought, what was it? It was essentially Marxism. It was essentially Leninism to some extent also. That it's the colonial powers, it's the capitalistic powers which are exploiting the working classes, which is exploiting third world countries like India. They are exploiting their resources, they are taking their resources and giving them nothing. So if you really try to understand Gandhi or Nehru or many other people who were involved in freedom struggle, it was inevitable and it was natural for them to be socialists. It was natural for them to be inclined towards the left. But at the same time, Gandhi comes along in the freedom struggle and he adopts a mixture of nativism, which is Indian nationalism, Indian history, Indian religion, Indian culture, Indian custom, ritual, everything, plus socialism. So it's a mix of leftist thought and also nativism to some extent. And Nehru, of course, since he is a disciple of Gandhi, he calls him his guru, he goes along with that thinking. So if you really think about the Congress party of the 1940s and the 1950s, it is a mixture of nativism, it's a mixture of Indian nationalism, along with socialism and along with some bits of Marxism. But we have to also remember that, the fact is the left did not like Nehru on many issues. That is why we had CPI, that is why we had CPIM. And that is why we had later on, various other versions of the left. Till Indira Gandhi, there was nationalism plus socialism. So if you look at our media narrative till Indira Gandhi, you will see, or if you look at cinema till Indira Gandhi was alive, till Indira Gandhi was in power, our cinema, our media, our academia was talking both nationalism and socialism. And there was no disagreement in any of the institutions. It was going along. So it was in a way a middle path. You're doing socialism. Your movies, for example, Amitabh Bachchan is the hero of the working classes in many of the movies. Your NCRT books are inculcating the feeling of nationalism. Nationalism is not a bad word at that point of time. We grew up when Indira Gandhi was, at least I was born when Indira was in power. And through that period, in the initial schooling period of my life, I was raised with the feeling that India is a nation and it is to be celebrated. So nobody thought that Indian nationalism is something wrong and you can't really associate with it. But at the same time, the leftist narrative that comes after Indira Gandhi is different. Indira Gandhi goes away, and what you really see, you see a shift in the narrative in media, in academia, in overall cinema, everywhere. And what is that shift? The shift is that nationalism becomes a taboo. You do not really want to be called a nationalist. Nationalism is seen something, something as bad as, say, religious fanaticism. So something is shifting because the Western narrative has also changed. If you really look at the narrative in Britain in 1947 or even in the 1950s, British nationalism is a very much an acceptable term. American nationalism again is an acceptable term. Everybody celebrates their own respective nationalism. Nobody really questions it. But through the 60s, now I'm making this argument because I'm a student of political science and political theory and history and also journalism. So that is why I'm trying to build a context here, how we have come to this point. In Europe, a new movement starts in academia, and it's called postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Postmodernism is essentially a theory where you are made to believe, you are basically told that nothing is objective, everything is subjective. Basically, the idea is that there is no truth, everything is relative. There are multiple truths. Your truth, my truth, his truth, her truth, they are all different truths. So there is no truth. And this idea of subjectivity is absorbed, and is absorbed not by just the academia overall, but it is absorbed by various other institutions also, by media, by different institutions of the state also. And it is happening across democracies. And what happens because of that, by the time Indira is gone, and globalization at the same time catches momentum. Everybody is talking about globalization. Everybody is talking about free trade. Everybody is talking about, China. China is emerging as the manufacturer of the world because they open up to the West. What most people don't realize that this postmodernism and the leftist ideology, which is socialism, which is Marxism, which is essentially that communist state is the only solution to the crony capitalism, to capitalism and a capitalistic driven society. All these forces and all these ideas sort of are used by agents of the leftist societies and leftist states. After World War II, China, Russia and all the leftist or the communist states, they see an opportunity in it. They see that all this can be used to drive a narrative. All this can be used to establish a narrative. And eventually in India you start hearing that, for example, in Kashmir, that it is not terrorism, it's right to self-determination. It is freedom struggle. And what is really happening in your backyard? Your CIA, the US has pushed in arms and ammunition into your neighborhood. It has given massive funding to Pakistan to fight Russians in Afghanistan, right? And in Afghanistan, what happens is Taliban is able to overthrow Soviet Union. They are able to defeat Russians, and they drive them out. And the same arms and ammunition that you have used, the same formula that you have used in Afghanistan, you use in Kashmir as well, right? But this cross-border terrorism that really happened because Jammu and Kashmir had acceded to India in 1947. So what happens in 89-90? That suddenly people take up arms and they are fighting Hindu India, so to say. And at the same time, your media is peddling this narrative that it is a freedom struggle. And it's not just your media. BBC, New York Times, the entire media in the West is peddling the same narrative, that there's a freedom struggle going on in Kashmir and not terrorism. That policy has continued over decades. Even today, if you really look at BBC or Reuters or Associated Press, they will they don't call them terrorists, they call them rebels. They will call them militia. They will call them guerrilla, insurgents. But they will not call them terrorists, despite the fact that United Nations has designated Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen as terror groups. They have declared Osama bin Laden and many other terrorists as terrorists. But media has internalized this entire leftist narrative. They have accepted these formulations, these ideas, because they don't even know who is driving this narrative. They don't even know what these terms mean and who is driving this narrative. When I gave you this entire history of how the NYT, used to call India as a land of snake charmers, or BBC used to refer to India in those terms. And I mentioned Edward Said, Orientalist, perspective. I'm essentially saying that the narrative is coming from the West, and that narrative in the West is being driven by the academia, and that academia is influenced by the leftist framework. That academia has absorbed and internalized the leftist, Marxist, socialist ideology, philosophy to an extent that it became postmodernism. It became, that there is no truth. There are multiple truths, therefore there is no truth. And that is why your media, which is taking a cue from the West constantly without realizing what they are doing to the fundamentals of a society, to the fundamental nature of the civilization, of Indian civilization, for example. You were made to feel bad about being Indian. You, in the last 30 years, after Indira Gandhi, 35 years, you were made to feel bad about nationalism. You've been made to feel bad that being a nationalistic is dirty, it's wrong, you shouldn't be talking in that language because it is not the truth, because it is fanaticism, it is fundamentalism. So that has happened because our media has not thought through these issues. Our media has not understood who is dictating this narrative. So as I said, that academia, media, for the longest time, we're talking for the last 70 years almost, they have been in control of narrative building. Because if you look at democracies like India, who was in power? As we know, in India, it has been mostly the Congress party. And as I said, I was giving you the history of the Congress party. They were both left and right. They were middle path, they were a little bit of leftism and a little bit of rightism. And therefore, media, all the institutions that have been built, whether it's media or academia, because cinema, these are the institutions which create perceptions, right? Perception building. What do people listen and read? What is your source of information? What is your source of knowledge? These are the institutions which create perceptions and which build narratives. And these institutions were under the control of the Congress party. Since Congress had a way of building narrative, it involved various elements, and a lot of element came from the left. if you read our NCERT books, if you read our history, you will notice that most of our historians were left-leaning. Not just the Congress party, they were essentially from somewhat affiliated to CPI, somewhat affiliated to CPIM. And historically, the English-speaking classes, as we know, in India have come from the left. They have not come from, the right. In fact, the right, when we talk about Indian right, we are talking about Hindu right, right? And Hindu right is essentially which has learned native language, which has used native language. So who was the English-speaking class in India? It was the left. So the left controlled these institutions, and these institutions drove the narrative that came from the West. And in the West, as I said, who was driving the narrative? It was the left, not the right. Again, if you look at the West, if you look at America, if you look at their institutions, and if you look the kind of framework they developed after World War II, it's entirely leftist in nature. Now here in media, how they were able to do it in CAA, or how they were able to do it on Kashmir. How is it that you heard only one perspective in the last 30 years or more? I'll take my own example. I think I have been a victim of their propaganda in many ways. I think, and I put this on record, I think every English-speaking person in India, is a victim of the leftist propaganda, leftist narrative in one or the other way. Some may be less, some may be more, some may be, in the middle, but we all have internalized the leftist propaganda in some or the other way. In Kashmir, for example, after 89-90, what did the media do? They sold Kashmir as a problem of human rights violations committed by the Indian state. That was their position. That was what was being sold by the Indian media. And when I say Indian media, I'm talking about English Indian media. I don't know what the vernacular press was doing. I don't know what Hindi press was saying. But English media was selling this. And why? I'll tell you why. 2-3 things are attached to this. In this profession, because I went to English journalism, I went to English media, there was a standard formula of success. What was that? You write human rights violation stories against the Indian state, you will go to junkets, you will get fellowships, you will get scholarships, you will get awards. You will get global recognition because you are bashing the Indian state. And why was that happening? Because it suited the West. The West has had a position on Kashmir, and it's a political position, as I was saying earlier. Their political position is that Kashmir is a dispute. From Indian perspective, Kashmir is not a dispute. Indian perspective, the matter was settled in 1947 when Jammu and Kashmir acceded to the Union of India. But from the point of view of the US or the UK or Europe or many other countries, till September 11, the position was that Kashmir is disputed. And at one point of time, we know that Bill Clinton was in favor of the freedom struggle in Kashmir. He was in favor of freedom for Kashmir. Why was that? And their media, the Western media, carried that line. The Western media has not deviated from that line. And our English media almost followed that line. So whom were we helping? Whom was the English media helping? English media was helping the Pakistani state, because that is the Pakistani position as well, that Kashmir is a dispute. Now CAA, Citizen Amendment bill, and which became the act. It was essentially giving citizenship, fast-track citizenship to the people, to the minorities in Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. And the minorities who are persecuted in these three Islamic republics because of their religious identity. If you were really liberal, if you were really a tolerant, pluralistic, secular person, you would have no issue with it. Because if you're talking about, persecution, if you're talking about minorities, you've been constantly feeding the Indian audience that minorities in India have suffered. Religious minorities, Muslims in India have suffered. You came up with such a commission report and said that in India, Muslims are the most persecuted community. You talked about other communities also, minorities also. So if you talked about your own minority communities, their persecution, and that is legitimate and that is fair and just in your point of view. But when it comes to the religious minorities, for example, Hindus in Pakistan, who were 14 to 15% at the time of the partition, and now they're negligible, they're not even existent, they're 0.1% or something. You don't feel a sense of responsibility towards that. Why? If you really claim that journalism is about, truth beyond borders, that's what you have sold to your journalists. That's what you're telling your journalists. Then talk about Pakistan's oppression of the minorities. Then talk about oppression of minorities in Bangladesh, where Al-Qaeda, ISIS and other Islamist organizations have slaughtered minorities. Talk about Kashmir, where an entire Hindu community was ethnically cleansed and they were subjected to the worst genocide ever in the history of India. You haven't talked about that. You haven't talked about the minorities in Afghanistan. So what are you doing? You're peddling a narrative which is aligned with a political group. And that political group has financial interests. Those financial interests are tied not only within your country, those financial interests are tied with powers and groups abroad. As I was saying, that media keeps peddling these narratives because it's a formula. It's a formula to have fellowships and scholarships and awards and going to foreign trips, having a good life, wine and dine. With who's who of the world, and have these power equations with powerful people in the West. So you will do it. And that is why you will see this hypocrisy getting repeated day after day, year after year. They will do it shamelessly. They will call me a victim of genocide, a victim of persecution, right-wing media. They will call me new Latins, only because I have found my voice and I am expressing my truth because I have experienced it. So your question that why are they able to do it successfully? Because they still control media, academia and cinema. That control remains there despite the fact we in India are supposedly under a Hindu right-wing government, but that right-wing government, I have to say it, actually has no control except for a few channels, television channels which are openly right-wing and openly nationalistic, because the left-wing made nationalism such a bad word and such a taboo that an entire space got created, a vacuum got created for somebody else to capture that, for somebody else to use that and cash on. And that's what happened. That's why for the longest time you had the leftist media and you thought everything was objective, everything was beautiful, everything was sensible, everything was civilized. But the day you saw that somebody else has occupied the opposite position, you said it is a polarized country, you said it's a polarized media, you said it is polarized society. It has become communal. We have become fascistic. We have become mad. But the only thing that has really happened in the last 10 years, I would say, after Mumbai terror attacks, is that right has also figured out that you can milk this system. You can create institutions which can peddle your point of view. So now we, I think, have come to a point where you have both left and right. You can say that as of today, right may be more dominant and left is not as dominant. But it depends. If you really look at digital platforms, I would say left is still more powerful. If you look at television, you may say right is more powerful. If you look at newspapers, I would say still left is more powerful. So it all depends. But ultimately, I would say it is going to take a long time for us to have the real balance between the left media and the right media. And I would really wish that media actually declared their positions up front. They should declare which school of thought they come from, which ideology and philosophy they come from. I, for example, I have unashamedly said that I'm socially liberal. And that liberalism is not because as I was saying, that I have been a victim of their propaganda. I have been a victim of their propaganda, and I'll explain that how. But I'm socially liberal because the society that I come from is fundamentally liberal. I was raised in a religious family, in a proper traditional family, but it's a liberal, open family. We were not held back from enjoying the freedoms that, boys were. We were not prevented from exercising our rights. I did not see gender discrimination. I did not see religious discrimination, at least in my family. We were not taught Hindu-Muslim. We were taught, that everybody is equal. And I went to an army school. My founding, my impressions came from army school education. And the army school education taught me, yes, India as a nation is to be celebrated. Nationalism is a great thing. Secularism is a great thing. Pluralism is a great thing. Diversity is a great thing. Unity in diversity is a great thing. So, but I'm socially liberal and I'm economically conservative. When it comes to security policy, I'm very realistic, I'm pragmatic, and I will stand up for Indian national interests. But if you say such things, you get labeled. You are seen as, Godi media, will get called Modi media, Godi media, whatever, all these terms, or New Latins media. But the truth is, as of today, there is no balance. We still have leftist narrative, which is being controlled by the leftist media and leftist cinema, leftist theatre, leftist academia. Very good question. See, there's something called white guilt. Now, many people would know this term, but for the sake of your audience, I want to explain. What is white guilt? After World War II, and even before World War II, we know that the West colonized most of the world. India, Africa, and then after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the creation of Israel, and the dispute of Palestine. And of course, the US and other Western powers together, their conspiracies to overthrow regimes which they did not like, because they were not in control of those regimes. Whether it was, Iran, for example, where they were running a certain regime, and then Iranian Revolution happened, and then they lost the control, right? Similarly, you colonized Africa, you colonized India, you colonized so many parts of the world, and you faced also uprisings. The Indian freedom fighters fought back. Somewhere in academia in the West, there's that guilt. The thinking people, the thinking white people, they feel bad about the atrocities, the kind of persecution, the kind of oppression that the West has done across the world. The Jewish Holocaust, after all, it was not, it were not Indians, it was not Japanese, it were not Muslims who persecuted Jews. It were the Germans. So that white guilt has penetrated so deep that the academia, that is why postmodernism found space. That is why postmodernism became fashionable. It became something, that many academics sort of liked and propagated it. So because of that, lot of permutation, combination in terms of left Islamists, right-wingers, lot of permutation, combination happened. And why did the left join Islamists? Why did they ally with them? Because of this white guilt, for example, on Palestine issue, they did feel that, Palestine had a justified cause, that Israel did not have, many academics felt that Israel did not have the right to exist. Even today in Israel, there are academics of the leftist persuasion who think, that Israel did something wrong. They deprived people of their homeland. They persecuted Palestinians. So it arises from there. And then this thought process, see, ultimately what happened because of globalization? One seedling, one idea became universal. Globalization had that power, that impact, because if something was churned out in, say, Europe or in the US academia or in UK academia, and India, an aspirational country, was looking towards the West, it adopted almost everything that was being peddled by the academia. So the left in the West felt that Muslims were being persecuted because of Israel, because Israel was being supported by the US, and also because US, for example, in Afghanistan, intervened because Soviet Union was there. Because of the Cold War, US also, intervened in many areas, especially the Muslim areas. If you look at Middle East, the US intervention throughout after World War II, you see that the superpower is engaged continuously. And who are getting killed? Muslims are getting killed. Who are killing them? Muslims are killing Muslims. So the left is constantly under that guilt trip that our state is killing Muslims. So they ally with Muslims. They ally with not just Muslims. They ally also with the hardcore Islamists. Now, this alliance is an unholy alliance because leftism is supposedly liberal idea. It's supposedly, basically, you don't really see any identity other than the working class identity, right? In the Marxist scheme of things, the only identity that should matter to you is the class. But with the Islamists and the Muslims, what are they seeing? They are seeing the religious identity. They are seeing that Muslims, the religious community of Muslims, are being targeted. Therefore, we are their saviors. We are sympathizing with them. And in this process, they are justifying the unjustifiable actions of hardcore Muslim terror groups like Hamas, like groups which essentially want freedom only to establish Islamic State. They don't want freedom to do anything else. They want, as I explained it in my previous video also, that the idea of Islamic State, it's almost like a mirage for them, and they're chasing it. And I think Tariq Fatah wrote a fabulous book that I really, really urge everyone to read, Chasing the Mirage of Islamic State. And all these Islamist groups are demanding Islamic State because, for example, in Iran, what happens in the Iranian Revolution? So all these states where the US had some control in Middle East or Muslim societies, they are being overthrown because the religious right takes over. The religious right wants Islamic State, Sharia law. That's exactly what happens in Iranian Revolution. And you will be surprised who actually defended Iranian revolution, who justified the idea of Islamic State, who justified the idea of Islamic resurgence. It was the left. It was the leftist academia. When I said, postmodernist, Foucault, the most celebrated postmodernist, he was the one who gave a complete clean sheet to the Islamists who overthrew the Shah's regime in Iran. So ultimately, what I'm saying is, I became a victim of this unholy alliance of the leftists and Islamists in the United States when I appeared for a US congressional hearing in 2019. I went to this congressional hearing because they were inviting people who had witnessed the post-August 5th, 2019 events in Kashmir. It was essentially for them, their subject was human rights violations in Kashmir because supposedly India was oppressing Kashmir after August 5th, 2019 when we reorganized the government of India, reorganized the state, integrated Jammu and Kashmir constitutionally completely. By creating 2 union territories and by nullifying Article 370 and 35A. So I went there as a witness to this US congressional hearing. And why did I go as a witness? Because I was in Kashmir from the day this nullification of 370 happened for almost a month. I covered all the events. Initially, there was a lockdown. It wasn't really a lockdown, but there was communication blockade. The government had shut down internet and phones and everything else. There was no communication. So I was there and I wanted to tell what I saw. But what happens in the US congressional hearing is you see Ilhan Omar, a known Islamist figure who is a congresswoman from the Democrat Party. So it is really strange that Democrats who call themselves liberal, they today have this alliance with Islamists like Ilhan Omar. And Ilhan Omar, who was being funded, who was being promoted and encouraged and supported by Qatar and Turkey and all these Islamist regimes, she comes to the congressional hearing, she reads out a script against me and she calls me an Indian state spokesperson. She accuses me of being an agent of the Indian state. And she does not even give me a chance to explain my position, to explain where I came from and why my account is the truthful account. So when I said I became a victim of this unholy alliance, I'm essentially saying that the liberals, the left today in the West, is completely in the grip of these Islamists because they are dictating the narrative. They are dictating the narrative of regimes like that of Pakistan, the Pakistani army, or for that matter, the Islamist regime in Turkey, right? So, and I, who comes from a secular country, who comes from a secular society, a person who comes from a liberal tradition, a person who has done her job faithfully and honesty and with integrity throughout my career, my professional career, I do not get a chance to put facts on the record. I do not get a chance to counter her. So, as of today, I would say their nexus is as strong as it was 30 years ago. I don't think their nexus has weakened, especially after the fact that, Joe Biden has come to power, Nancy Pelosi and Ilhan Omar, and the Gang of Five. Their narrative is the narrative that the Islamists in, say, Hamas are driving. The Islamists in Iran are driving. The Islamists in Saudi Arabia are driving. I would say that it is a very strong threat, because if you really look at the geopolitics of the world today, what is happening? China, which is a communist, supposedly a communist state, because it's being run by Chinese Communist Party, and it is a totalitarian state, it is one party system. Whom are they helping? Who are the people whom they are backing? Who are the states they are backing? They are backing Pakistan. And what is Pakistan's narrative? It's the same narrative that the left has adopted today. Whether it's their position on CAA, whether it is their position on Kashmir, whether it is their position on Ayodhya, whether it is their position on the Indian politics. It is coming from Pakistan, it is coming from Islamists, it's coming from Malaysia, it is coming from Turkey, it is coming from Qatar. And China's alliances with all these countries is very strong, and it is continuously backing them on all these issues. So at the same time, if you look at the power equation in the US today, or the narrative in Europe today. In Europe, in the US, the victim is are not the people who have suffered because of Islamist terrorism. The victim, for example, in France, let me give you this example. So Macron comes, the French president, he comes out in support of the French teacher who was beheaded for showing cartoons, the Danish cartoons, in a classroom on freedom of expression. Now, France has a history of, intellectualism on free speech, on free expression. Macron stands by that principle, by that tradition, by that history. But what happens? If you look at Twitter, if you look at Facebook, if you look at the big tech media today, what are they doing? They are going against the grain of liberal thought. They are going against the grain of Western liberal tradition. They are going against the grain of the native traditions of European countries or the US or the UK. And they are taking the position of Islamists. They did not. So Macron faced tremendous pressure and backlash from countries like Pakistan. It was Imran Khan's point of view that got a lot of traction on Twitter, because he slammed Macron. He slammed the whole idea of free expression and free speech. Similarly, if you look at the US today, what is happening in the US today? They are removing gender. So there is no gender now. There is no he, she. You can declare your pronouns. You can, you will get to decide who you are. If you Even if you are a male looking person, I have no right to call you he. I have no right to call you that you are a man. So what is the threat? The threat is that it is turning the entire society upside down. Today, there is normalization of blasphemy. Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab in Pakistan, who was killed, his assassin was celebrated in Pakistan. Imran Khan today is saying the same thing as the assassin of Salman Taseer, that blasphemy is not acceptable to Pakistan. Free speech will not be allowed. And Twitter and Facebook is accepting this as a norm. So, so the threat is real, because the idea of free speech, the idea of free expression, it is being shattered. It is being questioned. You are now seeing a tyranny of the big tech media. You are seeing too much focus on human rights violations in countries like India, which is a democracy, but you will not see the West, the leftist Islamist alliance, talking about the oppression of minorities in Islamic republics. You will not see the left and the Islamists talking about Uyghurs in China who are being indoctrinated, who are being rewired. Their brains are being rewired so that the Chinese Communist Party can cleanse them of Islam, because the CCP thinks that Islam is a disease. That's how they are treating Muslims in China. So on the one hand, you have democracies like India, because we are open, there is accountability, there is transparency, there is questioning. The media has the freedom to criticize the right-wing government. You know, you see day in, day out, you will see dozens and dozens of digital platforms in India bashing the Hindu right, bashing not just the Hindu right. Somebody even said that Kashmiri Pandits genocide is the most hyped issue. It does not need so much attention, despite the fact that for 30 years nobody talked about it in the mainstream English media. Then you have, on the other side, you have the left and the Islamists talking in one voice on issues like, you know, blasphemy. You are curtailing free speech. You are curtailing the freedoms that democracies enjoy. So the threat is real. You are turning societies upside down, and I think you are giving enough reason to native people of democracies to rise against this. I think there will be a pushback, there will be a backlash. You already saw what happened in the Capitol Hill, because of the US election results, which half of the population in the US did not accept, because they thought that the media controlled the narrative. The media peddled one sort of narrative against President Donald Trump. And they also felt that there was rigging, there was fraud of votes, there was fraud of narrative, there was fraud of campaigning, everything, you know. You demonized Donald Trump to an extent that, you turned everything against him, the institutions within the system. So the threat is definitely real, and India has to be careful, because India is a huge, huge country with multiple ethnicities, multiple languages. We are far more diverse than America, far more diverse than Europe, far more diverse than any other country or society in the world. And we have a lot of fault lines, therefore, because the West will use, when I say the West, I mean the left and the Islamists, who reject Indian democracy, who reject Indian society's pluralism, who reject India's cultural diversity, who reject India as an aspirational democratic republic, which wants to become bigger and more powerful than it is right now. And We have every reason to have that aspiration because we are a hardworking people. We have followed laws, we have followed our constitution, and we have a vision that our founding fathers of the Indian Republic gave us. We now have a different vision, and I think which is in sync with the vision of the Indian Constitution, which is being pushed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, of being self-reliant, of being self-sufficient, and at the same time being open and inclusive. These are his words. This is his vision, that we want to be inclusive. So we have not changed our philosophy, whether it's left-wing government, right-wing government, our philosophy remains the same, but the rest of the world will try its best. The left and the Islamists in the rest of the world will try to disrupt our system and our society through these institutions which create narratives. So perception and narrative building, I think, is the most important issue that every Indian should be thinking about today.